Tablet CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian section presents calculations that have occupied scholars for over a century. The cuneiform script records observations, measurements, and accumulated knowledge spanning generations. Yet these tablets, for all their mathematical sophistication, date to approximately 1800 BC, a mere 4,000 years ago. The archaeological record suggests that anatomically modern humans have existed for over 300,000 years. The genetic evidence points to behavioural modernity, emerging perhaps 70 to 100,000 years ago. Civilization, as conventionally defined, with cities, writing and centralised governance, began approximately 5 to 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. Between the emergence of our species and the development of what we call civilization lies an expanse of time so vast that it defies intuitive comprehension. If the entire span of Homo sapiens' existence were compressed into a single, 24-hour day, civilization would occupy only the final minutes before midnight. The preceding 23 hours and 55 minutes remain largely invisible to historical consciousness, a period during which fully modern humans, possessing the same cognitive architecture that would later produce philosophy, mathematics and literature, left virtually no written records of their existence. The question that confronts paleoanthropology, archaeology, and evolutionary biology is not merely what happened during these 100,000 years, but how to interpret the relationship between cognitive potential and cultural expression across such enormous timescales. The evidence suggests that the capacity for complex symbolic thought, language, and abstract reasoning predates the material signatures typically associated with behavioural modernity by tens of thousands of years, a temporal gap that challenges conventional models of human cognitive evolution. Fossils recovered from the Jebel Irhoud site in Morocco, approximately 100 kilometres west of Marrakesh, have fundamentally altered scientific understanding of human origins. The site, first excavated by miners seeking barite in the 1960s, initially yielded a remarkably complete skull that was classified, based on the geological assumptions of the era, as an African variant of Neanderthal. Subsequent analysis reclassified the remains as Homo sapiens, though persistent uncertainties regarding stratigraphic context limited interpretation. In 2004, paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, received authorization to reopen excavations at Jebel Irhoud. The project required rebuilding access roads and carefully removing approximately 7,000 cubic meters of collapsed sediment before reaching intact archaeological layers. What emerged transformed the understanding of human evolutionary chronology. New fossil remains, including partial skulls, jawbones, teeth, and long bones from at least 5 individuals, were recovered from sediment layers that thermoluminescence dating placed at approximately 315,000 years ago, more than 100,000 years older than the previously oldest accepted Homo sapiens fossils from Omo Kibish in Ethiopia. The Jebel Irhoud remains exhibit what researchers describe as a mosaic of features. The facial morphology, including a relatively small, retracted face that tucks beneath the brain case rather than projecting forward, aligns closely with anatomically modern humans. The dental morphology similarly corresponds to modern parameters, yet the neurocranium retains what paleontologists characterize as more archaic features, including an elongated brain case that differs from the globular cranial shape characteristic of later Homo sapiens populations. This anatomical combination suggests that modern human features did not emerge simultaneously as a unified package, but rather accumulated gradually across different anatomical systems over extended periods. The implications extend beyond simple chronological revision. Daniel Richter of the Max Planck Institute, who conducted the dating analysis, noted that the findings demonstrate Homo sapiens dispersal across the African continent far earlier than previously documented. The combination of Moroccan fossils with contemporaneous or slightly younger remains from eastern and southern Africa suggest a pan-African pattern of human evolution, with populations connected through gene flow across what are now dramatically different ecological zones. The archaeological context of the Jebel Irhoud remains proves equally significant. Associated stone tools belong to what archaeologists classify as Middle Stone Age technology, characterized by prepared core techniques, the production of flake tools, and evidence of planning depth in raw material acquisition. The presence of heated flints throughout the deposits indicates controlled fire use. Faunal remains, dominated by gazelle species, suggest systematic hunting practices. The material culture, in other words, demonstrates organised subsistence strategies and technological competence, though it lacks the elaborate symbolic artefacts that later came to be associated with behavioural modernity. This dissociation between anatomical modernity and the material signatures of behavioural complexity presents one of the central puzzles in human evolutionary research. The neural architecture capable of producing cave paintings, mathematical calculations, and philosophical systems was present in human populations 300,000 years ago. Yet the archaeological record shows such capabilities expressed only sporadically until approximately 50,000 years ago, when what some researchers call the creative explosion produced the cave paintings of Europe, the elaborate burial practices of the Upper Paleolithic, and the technological innovations that accompanied human dispersal across previously uninhabited environments. The southern coast of South Africa has emerged as one of the most significant regions for understanding this paradox. Along a stretch of coastline approximately 300 kilometres east of Cape Town lies Blombos Cave, a relatively small rock shelter formed by wave action during the Pleistocene. The cave, excavated since 1991 under the direction of Professor Christopher Henshelwood of the University of Bergen and the University of the Witwatersrand, has yielded evidence that fundamentally challenges Eurocentric models of cognitive evolution. The Middle Stone Age deposits at Blombos Cave span approximately 101,000 to 70,000 years ago, based on optically stimulated luminescence dating. Within these layers, researchers have recovered more than 70 marine shell beads made from the sea snail species Nassarius kraussianus. The beads were collected from estuaries located at least 20 kilometres from the cave site, deliberately perforated through the aperture using bone tools and strung for wear as personal ornaments. Microscopic analysis reveals use-wear patterns consistent with extended periods of suspension, indicating that these objects were not merely collected but actively worn as adornment. The significance of shell beads extends beyond their aesthetic function. As Henshelwood and colleagues argue, personal ornamentation represents unambiguous evidence for symbolically mediated behaviour. Unlike ochre use or tool production, which might serve purely functional purposes, the creation of standardized ornaments implies shared conventions about meaning, what semiotic theorists call the arbitrary relationship between sign and signified. A shell bead conveys information about identity, group membership, or social status only because a community agrees on its significance. This requires the cognitive infrastructure of symbolic communication, likely including some form of language. Perhaps more striking than the shell beads are the engraved ochre pieces recovered from the same archaeological levels. Ochre, an iron-rich mineral that produces red pigment when ground, appears at numerous Middle Stone Age sites throughout southern Africa, typically interpreted as evidence for body painting or other pigment use. At Blombos Cave, however, two ochre pieces dating to approximately 77,000 years ago bear deliberate geometric engravings. The patterns consist of cross-hatched lines, forming diamond shapes, executed with sufficient regularity to indicate intentional design rather than random marking. In 2018, researchers reported an even more significant discovery from Blombos Cave, a small silkrete flake bearing a cross-hatched pattern drawn with an ochre crayon. The artefact, recovered from approximately 73,000-year-old Middle Stone Age levels, represents the oldest known drawing made by a human hand. Unlike engravings, which require stone tools and considerable effort, a crayon drawing demonstrates a different relationship between intention and execution, what Henshelwood describes as the difference between having a chisel and having a ballpoint pen. The capacity to quickly mark surfaces with portable pigment suggests communication systems more elaborate than the surviving artifacts can directly reveal. The technological innovations documented at Blombos Cave extend to stone tool production as well. Analysis of bifacial points from the still bay levels, dated to approximately 75,000 years ago, reveals evidence of pressure flaking, a technique in which the toolmaker applies controlled force through a bone or antler point to remove small, precise flakes. This technique, combined with evidence that silkrete raw material was deliberately heat-treated to improve its flaking properties, indicates technological knowledge previously believed to have developed only in the European Upper Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years later. An ochre processing workshop discovered in 100,000-year-old deposits at Blombos Cave provides evidence for systematic pigment production. The toolkit consists of 2 abalone shells containing an ochre mixture, bone tools for grinding, and hammerstones, a complete technological package for creating paint or other pigmented preparations. The discovery suggests that ochre use in the Middle Stone Age involved more than opportunistic collection. It represented organised production systems maintained across generations. Approximately 80 kilometres northeast of Blombos Cave lies Pinnacle Point, a series of caves overlooking the Indian Ocean that have yielded evidence pushing the timeline for certain behaviours even earlier. Excavations led by Curtis Marian of Arizona State University's Institute of Human Origins documented the earliest known evidence for systematic shellfish exploitation, dating to approximately 164,000 years ago. The cave deposits contain brown mussel shells, limpets, and whale barnacles, the latter indicating that inhabitants scavenged from whale carcasses that washed ashore. Associated with these marine food remains were small bladelet stone tools and red ochre showing evidence of grinding. The dietary significance of marine resources may have exceeded their caloric contribution. Shellfish and other marine foods contain long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, docosahexaenoic acid and eicosapentaenoic acid, that are critical for brain development and function. Some researchers, including John Parkington of the University of Cape Town, have proposed that coastal foraging may have provided the nutritional substrate that supported the evolution of expanded human cognitive capacity. While this hypothesis remains debated, and the causal relationship is difficult to establish, the coincidence of early coastal adaptation with evidence for symbolic behaviour merits continued investigation. The geographic distribution of Middle Stone Age innovations suggests that the southern Cape coast of Africa may have served as a refugium during periods of harsh climate. Marine isotope stage 6, spanning approximately 190,000 to 130,000 years ago, brought glacial conditions that made much of Africa's interior inhospitable. Based on archaeological and paleoclimate evidence, researchers including Curtis Marian have proposed that the southern Cape, with its year-round access to coastal resources, could have sustained human populations that developed the cultural and technological innovations later carried throughout the continent and eventually beyond Africa. The Howissons Port Techno-Complex, named after the Howissons Port Rock Shelter near Grahamstown, South Africa, represents one of the most distinctive Middle Stone Age industries, dating to approximately 65,000 to 59,000 years ago, based on optically stimulated luminescence chronology, though some researchers have proposed slightly different date ranges depending on the site and dating method used. Howissons port assemblages appear across diverse ecological zones throughout southern Africa. The unifying characteristic is the production of small-backed tools, blades that have been deliberately blunted along one edge to facilitate hafting to wooden or bone handles. Research led by Lynn Wadley at Sibadu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal has documented the technological sophistication involved in Howissons port tool production. The manufacture of backed pieces required what archaeologists call marginal percussion, a technique in which the toolmaker strikes the edge of a striking platform rather than its surface, producing characteristic thin blades suitable for transformation into geometric segments and trapezes. This technique does not occur in the contemporaneous Middle Paleolithic of Europe, suggesting independent innovation in African technological systems. The function of backed tools remains debated among archaeologists. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that backed pieces can be effectively hafted as components of compound weapons, though a 2022 study led by Justin Pargeter found that backed stone tools were actually less successfully adhered to wooden shafts than unbacked alternatives. This unexpected finding raises questions about the intensive production of backed tools during the Howissons port. They may have served purposes beyond immediate functionality, perhaps including symbolic or social functions that the material record cannot directly reveal, or the hafting techniques used may have differed from those tested experimentally. Bone tools recovered from Howissons port levels at Sibadu Cave expand the documented technological repertoire of the period. 2 bone points and a polished spatula-shaped implement, dated to older than approximately 61,000 years ago, represent clear evidence for systematic bone tool production during this techno-complex. Useware analysis suggests the spatula was employed in hideworking, scraping animal skins to prepare leather. The bone points likely functioned as awls or projectile tips, demonstrating that Middle Stone Age populations exploited multiple raw materials for specialized tool production. The Howisson's Port's most intriguing characteristic may be its transience. After approximately 6,000 years of distinctive tool production across much of southern Africa, the backed tool industry largely disappeared, replaced by what archaeologists term, quote, four assemblages characterized by different technologies. This pattern of innovation, followed by apparent abandonment, poses challenges for linear models of cultural evolution. If backed tools represented technological improvements, why would populations revert to alternative techniques? The phenomenon suggests that cultural transmission in the Middle Stone Age operated through mechanisms that remain incompletely understood. The emergence of the Still Bay technocomplex immediately preceding the Howisson's Port in South African stratigraphic sequences demonstrates similarly distinctive characteristics. Still Bay assemblages, dated by Oa-Hillel and thermoluminescence techniques to approximately 75,000 to 71,000 years ago, are characterized by the production of bifacial foliate points, leaf-shaped tools worked on both surfaces with considerable skill. At sites including Blombos Cave and Sibadu Cave, Still Bay bifacial points show evidence of pressure flaking and, in some cases, deliberate ochre coating, suggesting that these tools may have carried significance beyond their functional utility as projectile points or knives. The relationship between the Still Bay and Howisson's Port has generated extensive scholarly debate. Both industries represent departures from generalized Middle Stone Age technology. Both appear across wide geographic areas within relatively constrained time periods, and both were subsequently replaced by more typical Middle Stone Age assemblages. Some researchers interpret this pattern as evidence for population dynamics, the spread of innovative groups followed by their replacement or absorption by differently adapted populations. Others emphasize environmental factors, noting that both industries correspond to particular climatic intervals within marine isotope stage 4. The archaeological evidence from southern Africa fundamentally challenges the model that behavioral modernity emerged suddenly through a genetic mutation or neurological reorganization approximately 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. The shell beads, engraved ochre, complex tool technologies, and systematic resource exploitation documented at Blombos Cave, Pinnacle Point, Sibadu Cave, and numerous other sites demonstrate that the cognitive capacities underlying symbolic behavior were present in African populations at least 100,000 years ago and potentially much earlier. This evidence aligns with genetic and fossil data suggesting that the neural architecture capable of supporting complex cognition evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. Anatomically, modern humans possessed brains as large as or larger than contemporary populations by at least 300,000 years ago. If the cognitive potential was present, the question becomes why material signatures of that potential appear only intermittently in the archaeological record until approximately 50,000 years ago. Several explanatory frameworks have been proposed. The demographic hypothesis, advanced by researchers including Sally McBrearty of the University of Connecticut and Alison Brooks of George Washington University, suggests that population size and density determine the persistence of complex cultural traditions. In small, isolated populations, innovations may develop but fail to achieve the cultural critical mass necessary for long-term transmission. Only when populations grew large enough to sustain social networks capable of maintaining and transmitting complex knowledge did behavioral modernity become archaeologically visible on a continuous basis. This hypothesis receives support from genetic evidence indicating extremely low effective population sizes during much of human prehistory. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA diversity suggest that human populations may have numbered only tens of thousands of individuals for extended periods during the Middle Pleistocene. Such small populations, even with fully modern cognitive capabilities, might have lacked the social infrastructure to maintain and develop complex cultural systems over multiple generations. The approximately 74,000-year-old eruption of the Toba supervolcano in Sumatra, Indonesia, has been proposed as a critical bottleneck event in human evolutionary history. The eruption, one of the largest in the past 2 million years, released approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material into the atmosphere, leading researchers to hypothesize that it produced a quote 5 that dramatically reduced human populations worldwide. Stanley Ambrose of the University of Illinois proposed in 1998 that Toba reduced the human population to perhaps 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals creating a genetic bottleneck whose effects are visible in the reduced diversity of modern human mitochondrial DNA. However, more recent research has substantially challenged this hypothesis. Archaeological evidence from sites in India, including the Jureru Valley in Andhra Pradesh, shows continuity of stone tool traditions across the Toba ash layer, indicating that local populations survived the eruption and its aftermath. Analysis of sediment cores from African lakes has failed to identify the severe vegetation disruption that a prolonged volcanic winter would have produced. A comprehensive 2020 review by Jian Gao in Quaternary International, examining multiple lines of evidence, argued that the volcanic winter model was based on overestimated sulfur dioxide injections in early climate simulations, and that available archaeological, genetic and paleo-environmental evidence does not support a Toba-induced population bottleneck. The current scientific consensus leans toward Toba having limited regional impacts rather than near extinction of our species. Whether or not Toba specifically caused dramatic population reduction, genetic evidence clearly indicates that human populations remained small through much of the late Pleistocene. The expansion that eventually populated the entire world began only around 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, following what geneticists term the main out-of-Africa dispersal. This expansion, traced through the distribution of mitochondrial haplogroups and Y chromosome variants, established the ancestral populations of all non-African peoples. The route and timing of this dispersal remain subjects of active research. Fossil evidence from caves in Israel, including Mislia Cave, dated to approximately 180,000 years ago, and the School and Kafsa caves dated to approximately 90,000 to 120,000 years ago, demonstrates that anatomically modern humans reached the Levant multiple times before the main dispersal that populated the rest of the world. These earlier populations apparently did not persist, leaving no clear genetic legacy in contemporary non-African populations. The successful dispersal appears to have followed a southern route, crossing the Red Sea at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and continuing along the Arabian and Indian coasts to Southeast Asia and eventually Australia. Evidence from Tam Pa Ling Cave in Laos, published in Nature Communications in 2024, indicates that modern humans reached mainland Southeast Asia between 68,000 and 86,000 years ago, though these early populations may not have contributed substantially to later demographic expansions. The primary dispersal that populated most of Eurasia occurred between approximately 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, with populations reaching Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, based on evidence from the Majid Beeb rock shelter in northern Australia. The encounter between dispersing modern humans and resident Neanderthal populations in western Eurasia produced what genetic analysis now reveals as extensive interbreeding. Non-African populations carry approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, the result of admixture events that occurred after modern humans left Africa, but before they had dispersed throughout Eurasia. Recent analysis by researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, published in December 2024, dates the primary period of Neanderthal-human interbreeding to approximately 47,000 years ago, lasting for approximately 7,000 years, the period during which both species coexisted in western Eurasia before Neanderthals disappeared approximately 40,000 years ago. The legacy of Neanderthal interbreeding extends beyond simple DNA inheritance to functional consequences for modern human biology. Neanderthal-derived genetic variants have been associated with immune system function, skin and hair characteristics, and circadian rhythm regulation. Some Neanderthal alleles appear to have been positively selected in human populations, suggesting that they conferred adaptive advantages in Eurasian environments. Other variants have been subject to negative selection, removed from the gene pool because of deleterious effects, a pattern that speaks to the biological consequences of hybridization between populations separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovan populations, known primarily from fragmentary remains recovered from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Russia, contributed an additional genetic legacy to certain human populations. Contemporary Melanesians carry approximately 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, indicating substantial interbreeding between ancestral Oceanian populations and Denisovans in Southeast Asia or nearby regions. Intriguingly, genetic variants associated with high-altitude adaptation in Tibetan populations appear to derive from Denisovan ancestry, suggesting that the Denisovan contribution may have conferred specific adaptive advantages. though the Denisovans themselves apparently occupied lowland or mid-elevation environments based on current fossil evidence. The interbreeding between modern humans and archaic hominin populations raises questions about the nature of species boundaries in human evolution. The capacity for successful interbreeding, producing fertile offspring, suggests that despite morphological differences, these populations had not achieved complete reproductive isolation. The emerging picture is of a complex web of gene flow connecting populations across vast geographic distances, rather than the simple replacement model that dominated earlier understanding of modern human origins. The archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic, beginning approximately 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, shows dramatic elaboration of material culture compared to preceding periods. Cave paintings in the Chauvet-Pont-d'Arc cave of southeastern France, radiocarbon dated to approximately 32,000 years ago, demonstrate artistic sophistication that rivals any subsequent human achievement. The animals depicted, cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, mammoths, horses, are rendered with attention to perspective, movement and anatomical detail that implies systematic observational study and developed representational conventions. Recent discoveries have significantly revised understanding of rock art chronology. Research published in Nature in January 2026 reports hand stencils from Liang Metanduno Cave on Muna Island, Indonesia, dated by laser ablation uranium series analysis to at least 67,800 years ago, currently the oldest securely dated cave art anywhere in the world. This finding exceeds the previous oldest dated rock art from the same Indonesian region by approximately 16,000 years and predates the oldest known European cave art by more than 25,000 years. The Indonesian rock art challenges the Eurocentric narrative that dominated understanding of artistic origins for over a century. When the Altamira cave paintings in Spain were discovered in 1879, scholars initially dismissed them as forgeries, unable to accept that primitive prehistoric peoples could produce such sophisticated imagery. Subsequent acceptance established European cave art as the benchmark against which all other prehistoric artistic traditions were measured. The Indonesian discoveries demonstrate that rock art traditions developed independently in multiple regions, likely reflecting universal human cognitive capacities rather than localized innovations that subsequently spread. The cave art of Sulawesi includes not only hand stencils but also figurative paintings of animals and, remarkably, what appear to be therianthropes, human figures with animal characteristics. A panel at Lingbulu Sipong 4, dated by laser ablation uranium series imaging to at least 51,200 years ago, depicts human-like figures with apparent animal attributes interacting with wild pigs and dwarf buffalo. This scene has been interpreted by researchers including Maximo Baer and Adam Broom of Griffith University as possibly representing a hunting narrative or mythological representation, which would suggest that by this date, human populations possessed the cognitive frameworks for complex storytelling and perhaps religious belief, though alternative interpretations of the imagery remain possible. The spread of modern humans across previously uninhabited environments required technological and social adaptations of considerable sophistication. Reaching Australia, even during glacial periods when sea levels were significantly lower than today, required crossing at least 8 substantial water gaps between islands of the Indonesian archipelago. The minimum crossing distance at Wallacea, the biogeographic boundary between Asian and Australian fauna, was approximately 90 kilometres of open water. This journey required watercraft capable of sustained ocean voyaging, navigational knowledge, and social organisation sufficient to coordinate group migration with children, provisions, and material culture. The colonisation of the Americas, while later in date, posed different challenges. Reaching the New World required either crossing the Bering Land Bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska during glacial periods, traversing the coastal margin by watercraft, or both. Archaeological evidence from sites including Monteverde in Chile, dated to approximately 14,500 years ago, demonstrates early human presence in South America. The Cerruti Mastodon site in California, controversially dated to approximately 130,000 years ago based on uranium series dating of modified bone, would, if accepted, require complete revision of understanding of American colonization, though most archaeologists remain highly skeptical of such early dates, citing concerns about the dating methodology and the interpretation of the bone modifications as human-made rather than natural. The colonization of high-latitude environments required specific technological innovations including tailored clothing, insulated shelters, and specialized hunting equipment. Analysis of bone tools from sites in Russia and Alaska suggests that eyed needles, enabling the production of fitted garments, appeared approximately 30,000 to 40,000 years ago. The capacity to survive winters with temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius represented a genuine behavioral threshold that earlier hominin species apparently never crossed, despite the presence of Neanderthals in Europe during multiple glacial periods. The subsistence strategies of Pleistocene human populations varied enormously, depending on environment and available resources. In tropical and subtropical regions, plant foods likely contributed significantly to diet, though such remains preserve poorly in archaeological contexts. In temperate and high-latitude environments, hunting provided the primary food source, with different prey species exploited according to local availability. The faunal remains from Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe document the exploitation of reindeer, horses, mammoths, bison, and numerous other species, often with evidence for seasonal specialization and coordinated hunting strategies. The extinction of Pleistocene megafauna, including mammoths, giant ground sloths, and numerous other large-bodied species, has been attributed to various causes including climate change, human hunting pressure, or some combination of both. The timing of extinctions correlates broadly with human arrival in previously uninhabited regions, which has led researchers to suggest that human predation played at least a contributing role. Continental Australia lost approximately 85% of its large mammal species within millennia of human colonization. The Americas experienced similarly dramatic megafaunal collapse following the arrival of human populations from Siberia. However, establishing direct causation remains difficult, as climate shifts also occurred during these periods, and the relative contributions of human hunting versus environmental change continue to be debated. The relationship between prehistoric human populations and their environments was not simply extractive. Evidence from multiple regions suggests that Pleistocene hunter-gatherers actively managed landscapes through practices including controlled burning. Fire use to modify vegetation, drive game, and promote the growth of desired plant species appears to have been widespread, potentially reshaping ecosystems over thousands of years before the development of agriculture. The boundary between "8" and "9" environments may be far more blurred than traditionally assumed. The remarkable site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey has fundamentally challenged assumptions about the relationship between subsistence strategies and monumental construction. Excavations begun in 1995 by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute revealed a complex of circular stone structures featuring massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing up to 5.5 meters tall and weighing as much as 50 metric tons. The pillars are decorated with intricate carvings of animals including lions, foxes, snakes, scorpions, and vultures, executed with considerable skill and artistic sophistication. Radiocarbon dating places the construction of Göbekli Tepe's earliest monumental structures at approximately 9,600 BC, approximately 11,600 years ago, predating Stonehenge by approximately 6,000 years, and the Egyptian pyramids by approximately 7,000 years. Most remarkably, the site appears to predate agriculture. The faunal remains from Göbekli Tepe are dominated by wild gazelle, with no evidence for domesticated animals. Plant remains similarly show no indication of cultivated species. The builders of these monuments were apparently hunter-gatherers, not the sedentary farming communities that conventional models associated with monumental construction. The architectural sophistication demonstrated at Göbekli Tepe implies organizational capacities previously considered impossible for non-agricultural societies. Experimental archaeology suggests that carving and moving pillars of the size found at Göbekli Tepe would have required coordinated labor forces numbering in the dozens or hundreds, working over extended periods. Such labor mobilization was thought to require the surplus production and social hierarchy associated with agricultural economies. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that hunter-gatherers could achieve levels of social organization and cooperative labor that traditional models attributed only to later periods. The late Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations from 1995 until his death in 2014, proposed that Göbekli Tepe represented a reversal of conventional evolutionary sequences. Rather than agriculture enabling the development of complex social organization and religious architecture, the demands of constructing and maintaining religious sites may have driven the adoption of agriculture. In Schmidt's view, the cultivation of wild cereals, whose domesticated descendants would become the foundation of Near Eastern agriculture, may have begun as a means of provisioning the labour forces gathered at monumental sites. This _10_hypothesis remains influential, though recent excavations have revealed evidence that complicates the picture. Somewhat. Research conducted since Schmidt's death in 2014, led by Turkish prehistorian Necmi Karul and German Archaeological Institute archaeologist Lee Clare, has identified evidence for domestic structures and extensive cereal processing at Göbekli Tepe, suggesting that the site may have supported a settlement population rather than serving purely ceremonial functions for nomadic visitors. The presence of rock-cut cisterns indicates water management infrastructure consistent with semi-permanent habitation. Whether or not Schmidt's specific _11 hypothesis proves correct, Göbekli Tepe demonstrates levels of social and technological complexity in late Pleistocene/early Holocene populations that fundamentally revise understanding of human capabilities during this transitional period. The question of what humans did during the 100,000 years before civilization resists simple answers, because human populations during this period were not doing any single thing. The archaeological record reveals enormous diversity in subsistence strategies, technological traditions, artistic expressions, and social organizations across different times and places. Some populations developed sophisticated maritime adaptations, exploiting coastal and aquatic resources with specialized technologies. Others specialized in terrestrial hunting, tracking herds of migratory animals across seasonal ranges. Still others apparently combined multiple strategies, adjusting their activities to available resources across annual cycles. Population estimates for the Pleistocene are necessarily imprecise, but modelling based on ethnographic data from contemporary hunter-gatherer populations and archaeological site densities suggests global human populations may have remained below 1 million individuals for most of human prehistory. A recent model published in Nature Communications estimated that pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations, assuming technologies comparable to historically documented foraging societies, could have numbered approximately 17 million individuals globally, though this figure likely overestimates Pleistocene populations, which had access to less developed technologies than ethnographically recorded groups. These small, dispersed populations lived in social groups that ethnographic analogy suggests typically numbered a few dozen individuals, consisting of several family units. Such bands maintained connections with neighbouring groups through exchange networks, intermarriage, and seasonal aggregations, creating the social infrastructure for cultural transmission across generations and geographic space. The archaeological evidence for long-distance raw material transport, obsidian, marine shells, and distinctive stone types found hundreds of kilometres from their sources, documents these exchange relationships materially. The cognitive and social capacities that would eventually produce civilization were present in human populations for tens of thousands of years before their full expression in the archaeological record. The individuals who lived 100,000 years ago, who created the shell beads at Blombos Cave and the stone tools at Pinnacle Point, possessed the same fundamental cognitive architecture as those who would later build the pyramids, compose symphonies, and develop quantum mechanics. The difference lies not in intrinsic capability, but in accumulated cultural knowledge, population size, environmental conditions, and the complex interactions between all these factors. The transition to agriculture, beginning independently in multiple world regions approximately 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, fundamentally transformed human societies. The capacity to produce food surplus enabled population growth, sedentary settlement, craft specialization, social stratification, and ultimately the emergence of states. Writing systems developed initially for administrative record-keeping, tracking surplus, recording transactions, documenting obligations, and only later expanded to preserve literature, history, and philosophy. The historical period, defined by the availability of written records, encompasses only approximately 5,000 years, or less than 2% of Homo sapiens' existence. What was lost in this transition may be as significant as what was gained. Hunter-gatherer populations, as documented ethnographically, typically worked fewer hours per day to secure subsistence than agricultural or industrial populations. Their diets were often more diverse and nutritionally complete than those of early farmers, who depended on a narrow range of domesticated crops. Skeletal evidence from the transition to agriculture shows increases in dental cavities, infectious disease, and nutritional deficiencies, the biological costs of civilization's demographic success. The missing 100,000 years were not, in any meaningful sense, empty. They were filled with the lives of billions of individual humans, each navigating the challenges of survival, reproduction, and social existence with the same cognitive capacities that characterize contemporary populations. These individuals loved, grieved, wondered about their origins and destinies, told stories, created beauty, and transmitted knowledge to subsequent generations. That most of their specific experiences remain archaeologically invisible does not diminish their reality or significance. The archaeological record provides glimpses, tantalizing, partial, and often ambiguous, of this vast human past. Each new discovery, whether a dated hand stencil on an Indonesian cave wall or a previously unknown stone tool industry, adds detail to the emerging picture. The pattern that emerges is not of steady linear progress towards civilization, but of multiple experiments in cultural elaboration, some persisting and accumulating, others disappearing without apparent descendants. The cognitive potential for complex symbolic culture was present throughout. Its expression depended on demographic, environmental, and historical contingencies that the archaeological record can only partially illuminate. The study of this extended human prehistory remains methodologically challenging. The material culture that survives, stone tools, bone fragments, occasional ornaments, rare preserved organics, represents only a tiny fraction of the cultural systems that produced it. Technologies based on wood, fibre, and other perishable materials have left no direct archaeological trace, though their existence can sometimes be inferred from the tools used to manufacture them. The songs, stories, rituals, and social relationships that constituted the lived experience of prehistoric populations are entirely invisible to archaeology, recoverable only through analogy with ethnographically documented societies whose relevance to ancient contexts cannot be assumed. The evidence nonetheless demonstrates that the cognitive capacity for everything characterizing modern human culture was present by at least 100,000 years ago, and likely much earlier. The individuals who painted the cave walls of Sulawesi 67,000 years ago possessed the same potential for abstract thought, symbolic communication, and creative expression as those who would later write the Epic of Gilgamesh, design the Parthenon, or compose the well-tempered clavier. The archaeological signatures of these capabilities appear intermittently across time and space, probably reflecting demographic and environmental factors rather than fundamental cognitive differences. This perspective invites reconsideration of what behavioral modernity actually means, and whether it represents a useful analytical category. If fully modern cognitive capacities were present in African populations 300,000 years ago, as fossil and genetic evidence suggests, then the intermittent archaeological visibility of symbolic behaviour may say more about the conditions necessary for its preservation and expression than about its actual distribution in prehistoric populations. The creative explosion of the European Upper Paleolithic, once interpreted as evidence for a late cognitive leap, may instead represent improved archaeological visibility, resulting from the preservation conditions of European caves, the intensity of archaeological research in Europe, and the demographic expansion that followed human colonization of previously uninhabited territory. The 100,000 years before civilization were not missing. They were simply different from what followed. Human populations during this period lived in ways that left limited material traces, while nonetheless engaging in the full range of human cognitive and social behaviours. Their achievements, though largely invisible to archaeology, established the foundation upon which subsequent developments built. Every innovation in tool technology, every refinement in subsistence strategy, every development in social organisation accumulated across generations, creating the cultural reservoir from which agricultural societies eventually drew. The archaeological record from this period continues to expand as new sites are discovered and new analytical techniques are developed. Advances in dating methods, ancient DNA analysis, paleoclimate reconstruction, and computational modelling are enabling increasingly sophisticated reconstruction of prehistoric human populations and their behaviours. Each new finding challenges previous assumptions and opens new questions for investigation. The 100,000 years before civilization remain, in many respects, the final frontier of human history, a vast territory of human experience that we are only beginning to explore. The tablets in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the shell beads at Blombos Cave, the hand stencils on Indonesian cave walls, the monumental pillars of Göbekli Tepe, these scattered artifacts represent the material residue of human lives lived across incomprehensible spans of time. Behind each artifact stood individuals with hopes, fears, relationships and inner lives as rich and complex as any contemporary person's. That we cannot access those inner lives directly does not make them less real. It merely reminds us of the limitations of archaeological knowledge and the vastness of the human past that extends beyond our ability to fully recover or comprehend. The scholarly conversation surrounding these materials continues to evolve as new evidence accumulates and interpretive frameworks develop. Questions regarding the relationship between cognitive potential and cultural expression, the role of demographic factors in maintaining complex traditions, the environmental conditions that facilitated or constrained human behavioral flexibility, and the nature of the transition from foraging to agricultural economies remain subjects of active research and vigorous debate. The answers, when they come, will reshape understanding not only of the deep human past, but of human nature itself, what it means to be a member of this species with its remarkable cognitive capacities, its complex social systems, and its capacity for both creation and destruction on scales unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. The evidence examined in this investigation establishes several key findings. First, anatomically modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years, based on fossil remains from Jebel Irhoud, Morocco, and related sites across Africa. Second, evidence for symbolic behaviour, including personal ornamentation, abstract engravings, and sophisticated tool technologies, appears in the archaeological record at least 100,000 years ago and possibly earlier, concentrated particularly in southern Africa. Third, the successful dispersal of modern humans from Africa to populate the rest of the world occurred primarily between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago, though earlier dispersals reached the Levant and possibly beyond without establishing permanent populations. Fourth, interbreeding between modern humans and archaic hominin populations, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, contributed genetic material that persists in contemporary human populations. Fifth, the capacity for monumental construction and complex social organisation existed in pre-agricultural societies as demonstrated by Göbekli Tepe and related sites, challenging conventional models of cultural evolution. These findings suggest that the development of human civilization represented not the emergence of qualitatively new cognitive capacities, but rather the creation of social, technological, and environmental conditions that enabled the full expression of capacities that had existed for tens of thousands of years. The agricultural revolution, the development of writing, the emergence of states, these transformations built upon a foundation of human cognitive and cultural achievement that extended deep into prehistory. Understanding this foundation remains essential for comprehending what humans are, how we came to be this way, and what possibilities remain open for our collective future. The 100,000 years before civilization were not empty time awaiting the arrival of history. They were filled with human lives, human achievements, human struggles, and human creativity. That we cannot read the thoughts of those who lived during this period does not mean they did not think. That we cannot hear their songs does not mean they did not sing. That we cannot see their faces does not mean they were not, in every meaningful sense, fully human beings navigating the challenges and opportunities of existence with the same cognitive toolkit that we employ today. The archaeological record, fragmentary and ambiguous as it remains, provides sufficient evidence to establish that the deep human past was rich, with achievement that subsequent generations built upon, transformed, and in many cases surpassed, but never wholly transcended. Script length, approximately 6,500 words. Continuing with additional sections to reach the 14,000 plus word requirement. The chronological framework for understanding human prehistory has undergone significant revision over the past 2 decades, with implications that extend beyond academic discourse to fundamental questions about human identity and capability. The traditional model, which posited that anatomically modern humans evolved approximately 200,000 years ago in eastern Africa and developed suddenly around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, has been systematically challenged by multiple lines of evidence. The Jebel Irhoud fossils pushed human origins back by at least 100,000 years while demonstrating a Pan-African rather than narrowly Eastern African pattern of evolution. The Southern African Middle Stone Age sites documented symbolic behaviour 100,000 years ago or earlier. The Indonesian rock art predated European cave paintings by tens of thousands of years. Each discovery eroded confidence in Eurocentric models of cognitive evolution that had dominated scientific thought for over a century. The implications of this revised chronology for understanding human cognitive evolution deserve careful consideration. If fully modern brains existed 300,000 years ago, and if evidence for symbolic thought appears at least 100,000 years ago, then the quote 16 of the European Upper Paleolithic cannot represent the sudden emergence of modern cognition through genetic mutation or neurological reorganization. The cognitive infrastructure was already in place. What changed were the conditions that enabled its expression and archaeological preservation. Several factors likely contributed to increased visibility of behavioural complexity in the archaeological record after approximately 50,000 years ago. Population growth, resulting from successful colonisation of new environments and possible improvements in subsistence technology, would have increased the statistical probability of preserving evidence for any given behaviour. Larger populations could also maintain more complex cultural traditions through redundancy in cultural transmission. If knowledge is held by many individuals, the loss of any single individual does not extinguish the tradition. Climate change during the late Pleistocene created both challenges and opportunities for human populations. Glacial periods reduced available habitat in high-latitude regions, while exposing continental shelves and land bridges that facilitated migration. Interglacial periods expanded temperate and tropical habitats, while raising sea levels and fragmenting previously connected populations. These environmental fluctuations may have selected for behavioural flexibility and technological innovation, creating evolutionary pressure for the cultural elaboration visible in the later archaeological record. The colonisation of new environments, particularly the relatively recent occupation of regions beyond Africa and adjacent portions of Eurasia, would have required cultural adaptations with material correlates. Surviving in Australian deserts, Siberian tundra, or Pacific islands demanded specific technologies and social organisations that left archaeological traces. The apparent cultural elaboration of the Upper Paleolithic may reflect not cognitive change but environmental challenge, the demands of colonising unfamiliar and often harsh environments. The concept of, quote, 17, the ability to accumulate and transmit improvements across generations rather than reinventing solutions from scratch, has emerged as a key variable in explaining human cultural evolution. Mathematical models developed by researchers including Joseph Henrich of Harvard University suggest that cumulative cultural evolution depends critically on population size and connectivity. Small isolated populations lose adaptive innovations faster than they can develop new ones, resulting in cultural simplification. Large, interconnected populations maintain and develop innovations through redundancy in cultural storage and frequency-dependent social learning. This demographic perspective helps explain the intermittent appearance of cultural complexity in the Middle Stone Age record. The Still Bay and Howisson's port industries, with their distinctive technologies and apparent symbolic expressions, may represent periods when favourable environmental conditions permitted population expansion and increased connectivity. Their subsequent disappearance may reflect population contractions during less favourable periods, with the loss of demographic support for maintaining complex traditions. The pattern would not require any change in underlying cognitive capacity, only in the demographic conditions necessary for its expression. The recent discovery that Neanderthal populations may also have produced symbolic artefacts has added further complexity to this picture. Cave paintings in Spain, dated by uranium series techniques to approximately 65,000 years ago, predate the arrival of modern humans in Europe and have been attributed by some researchers to Neanderthals. Though this dating and the attribution remains controversial and continues to be debated, eagle talon ornaments at multiple European sites similarly suggest Neanderthal engagement with symbolic behaviour, If these attributions are correct, symbolic cognition may not have been unique to Homo sapiens, and the cognitive foundations for such behaviour may have been present in the common ancestor of both species, pushing the origins of symbolic capacity even further back in evolutionary time than current evidence from modern human sites indicates. The genetic evidence for interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals raises additional questions about cognitive differences between populations. If modern humans readily interbred with Neanderthals, producing fertile offspring whose descendants contribute to contemporary human genetic diversity, then the cognitive differences between these populations cannot have been as profound as earlier models suggested. The hybrid offspring apparently functioned normally within modern human societies. They were not sterile or cognitively impaired. This suggests substantial cognitive overlap between populations that traditional classifications treated as distinct species. The dietary adaptations documented at Middle Stone Age coastal sites have attracted considerable attention from researchers interested in the nutritional basis of brain evolution. The human brain, despite comprising only approximately 2% of body mass, consumes approximately 20% of metabolic energy at rest. Maintaining such an energetically expensive organ required reliable access to high-quality foods, particularly during development. Marine foods, with their high concentrations of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids, may have provided critical nutritional support for brain development and function. The quote 18, which proposes that human evolution was substantially shaped by adaptation to aquatic or coastal environments, remains controversial among paleoanthropologists. However, the evidence from sites including Pinnacle Point demonstrating early systematic exploitation of marine resources suggests that coastal adaptation was an important component of human behavioural repertoires by at least 164,000 years ago. Whether this adaptation shaped human cognitive evolution or merely exploited pre-existing capabilities remains debated. The material culture associated with Middle Stone Age coastal sites shows technological sophistication beyond simple shellfish collection. Bladelet technology, documented at Pinnacle Point in levels contemporary with early shellfish exploitation, represents a distinct tradition of small blade production with potential applications in compound tools and hafted weapons. The combination of marine resource exploitation, specialized lithic technology, and ochre use suggests behavioral systems more complex than basic foraging. The role of fire in human evolution and prehistory extends beyond its obvious applications in cooking and warmth. Controlled fire use, documented at numerous Middle Stone Age sites through evidence including heated stone tools, ash deposits, and thermally altered sediments, enabled processing of plant foods to increase their nutritional availability, hardening of wooden spears and tools, production of adhesives for hafting composite tools, and social activities around hearths. The hearth may well have served as a focus for storytelling and cultural transmission, extending the period available for social interaction beyond daylight hours, though the nature of such activities can only be inferred from ethnographic analogy with more recent human societies. Evidence for heat treatment of stone to improve its flaking properties, documented at Pinnacle Point by approximately 164,000 years ago, demonstrates understanding of material transformation that implies experimental inquiry and knowledge accumulation. Heat treatment requires sustained temperatures of several hundred degrees Celsius maintained for extended periods, followed by controlled cooling. The process produces subtle changes in silica structure that improve flaking predictability and enable production of thinner, sharper tools. Developing this technique required observation of accidental heat effects on stone, experimentation with controlled heating, and transmission of successful techniques across generations. The pyrotechnology evident in Middle Stone Age contexts challenges assumptions about the cognitive complexity of these populations. Understanding that heat could transform stone properties, developing techniques to control the heating process, and recognizing the improved flaking characteristics of treated material requires causal reasoning, experimental methodology, and accumulated knowledge. These capacities are indistinguishable from those employed in scientific inquiry, differing only in the knowledge base available and the problems addressed. The evidence for hafting composite tools in the Middle Stone Age similarly demonstrates sophisticated understanding of materials and their combination. Analysis of residues on stone tools from sites including Sibidu Cave reveals ochre-based adhesives used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Creating effective hafting adhesives requires combining multiple ingredients in appropriate proportions, processing them through heating or other treatments, and understanding their binding properties. The recipes involved knowledge of plant gums, animal fats, and mineral additives that would have required extended experimentation to develop. The bow and arrow represents one of the most cognitively demanding technologies developed by prehistoric human populations. Analysis of backed microliths from the Howison's port has led some researchers to suggest that these tools may have served as arrowheads or barbs, potentially indicating bow technology by 65,000 years ago, though this interpretation remains contested, and the tools could have been used in other composite weapons such as hafted spears. If the bow and arrow hypothesis is correct, it would imply understanding of stored energy, trajectory prediction, the aerodynamics of fletched projectiles, and the coordination of multiple components including bow, string, and arrow, representing abstract reasoning about physical processes that would have been difficult to observe directly. The question of when human populations developed language remains one of the most challenging problems in prehistoric research. Language leaves no direct archaeological trace. Even writing systems, which developed only approximately 5,000 years ago, represent a secondary technology for recording language that already existed in fully developed form. Arguments for ancient language origins rely on indirect evidence including brain size and structure, the anatomy of the vocal tract as reconstructed from fossil evidence, the presence of symbolic artifacts implying symbolic cognition, and the complexity of material culture implying communication systems capable of transmitting detailed instructions. The FOXP2 gene, often characterized as a quote, 19, provides some genetic evidence bearing on language evolution. Humans and Neanderthals share the same sequence of this gene, which differs from chimpanzee sequences at key positions. Since the human Neanderthal lineage split from the common ancestor with chimpanzees approximately 6 to 7 million years ago, the FOXP2 mutations relevant to speech production must have occurred before the Neanderthal-human divergence approximately 500,000 to 700,000 years ago. This suggests that the genetic foundations for speech may be quite ancient, though the relationship between FOXP2 and language capacity is more complex than early characterizations implied. The symbolic artifacts from sites including Blombos Cave provide the strongest archaeological evidence for language in Middle Stone Age populations. The creation of standardized ornaments implies shared conventions about meaning that likely required verbal discussion to establish and transmit. The geometric engravings on ochre pieces may represent a form of graphic communication complementary to verbal language. While none of this evidence proves the existence of fully developed language 100,000 years ago, it strongly suggests communicative systems more elaborate than any non-human primate has demonstrated. The social organization of Middle Stone Age populations remains largely inferential, based on ethnographic analogy with historically documented hunter-gatherer societies. Such analogies must be applied cautiously, as contemporary hunter-gatherers have been influenced by centuries of contact with agricultural and industrial societies. However, certain organizational features may have been constrained by the requirements of mobile foraging lifestyles in ways that permit cautious reconstruction. Band-level organization, typically comprising approximately 25 to 50 individuals, organized around nuclear or extended families, appears to characterize most ethnographically documented hunter-gatherer societies. Such groups are small enough for all members to know each other personally, while large enough to buffer against individual misfortune and maintain viable breeding populations. Archaeological evidence for site use in the Middle Stone Age suggests similar group sizes, based on the extent of activity areas and the quantities of accumulated debris. Interband exchange networks, documented ethnographically through the movement of raw materials, ornaments, and marriage partners, have left archaeological traces in the form of exotic materials found far from their geological sources. Obsidian, marine shells, and distinctive stone types have been identified at Middle Stone Age sites hundreds of kilometers from possible sources, demonstrating that exchange relationships connected distant populations. These networks would have served social as well as material functions, maintaining relationships that could provide refuge during local resource failures and partners for demographic viability. The gender division of labour, with men focusing primarily on hunting and women on gathering, represents one of the most consistent patterns in ethnographically documented foraging societies. Whether this pattern characterized Middle Stone Age populations remains uncertain, As the archaeological evidence rarely permits direct inference about who performed specific activities. The sexual dimorphism of modern humans, with males averaging larger body size than females, is consistent with the hypothesis that different activity patterns extend deep into prehistory, though the specific nature of any such division would have varied across environments and cultural contexts. The spiritual and religious beliefs of Middle Stone Age populations remain entirely speculative in the absence of clear ritual contexts or iconographic evidence that can be confidently interpreted. Burial practices, which in later periods provide insight into beliefs about death and afterlife, are rarely documented in Middle Stone Age contexts. The few examples of apparent deliberate burial, including remains from Border Cave in South Africa, provide insufficient evidence for reconstruction of associated beliefs. The ochre and ornaments found in some burial contexts might indicate beliefs about preparation for afterlife, or might simply reflect the personal effects of the deceased. The question of whether Middle Stone Age populations possessed religious beliefs or spiritual practices ultimately cannot be answered with available evidence. The cognitive capacities necessary for religious thought, including theory of mind, causal reasoning, and counterfactual imagination, were certainly present, as demonstrated by other evidence for symbolic and abstract cognition. Whether these capacities were applied to supernatural domains remains unknown. The elaborate religious systems documented in the Upper Paleolithic, including possible shamanic imagery in cave paintings and ritual deposits of animal remains, may represent elaborations of pre-existing beliefs or entirely new developments. The transition from the Middle Stone Age to the Later Stone Age in Africa, and from the Middle Paleolithic to the Upper Paleolithic in Eurasia, marks what earlier scholarship characterized as a revolutionary transformation in human behavior. Modern research has substantially complicated this picture, demonstrating continuity in many aspects of technology and behavior across this boundary, while acknowledging genuine changes in other domains. The rate and nature of change varied among regions, with some areas showing gradual transitions and others more abrupt shifts. The replacement of Neanderthal populations by modern humans in Europe, completed by approximately 40,000 years ago, has generated extensive research and debate. Earlier models characterized this replacement as a result of modern human competitive superiority, superior technology, language, or social organization enabling modern humans to outcompete Neanderthals for resources. Modern research has substantially qualified this picture. The genetic evidence for interbreeding demonstrates that replacement was not complete. Neanderthal genes persist in all non-African populations. Archaeological comparisons suggest less dramatic technological differences between late Neanderthals and early modern humans in Europe than previously assumed. Several hypotheses have been proposed to explain Neanderthal extinction. Disease transmission from modern human populations, whose African origins may have exposed them to pathogens to which Neanderthals had no immunity, could have contributed to population decline. Climate instability during the period of overlap, with rapid oscillations between warm and cold conditions, may have disadvantaged Neanderthal populations adapted to relatively stable glacial environments. The demographic weight of modern human populations, growing through both natural increase and continued migration from Africa and Western Asia, may have gradually absorbed or displaced smaller Neanderthal populations. Most likely, some combination of these factors, operating with different intensity in different regions, contributed to the eventual disappearance of Neanderthal populations. The cognitive and behavioral differences between Neanderthals and modern humans, once characterized as profound, appear increasingly subtle in light of recent research. Neanderthals produced stone tools of considerable sophistication, exploited a wide range of plant and animal resources, used fire for cooking and warmth, cared for injured and disabled group members, and buried at least some of their dead with apparent deliberation. The Spanish cave paintings attributed to Neanderthals, if the dating holds up to scrutiny, demonstrate symbolic behavior previously thought unique to modern humans. The emerging picture is of populations with overlapping behavioral repertoires, differing perhaps in degree rather than kind. The colonization of Australia by modern human populations, accomplished by at least 65,000 years ago, based on evidence from Majedbebi rock shelter in northern Australia, represents one of the most remarkable achievements of prehistoric humanity. Reaching Australia required crossing the Wallace Line, the biogeographic boundary between Asian and Australian fauna that even during glacial periods was never completely bridged by land. The minimum water crossing required was approximately 90 kilometres of open ocean, far beyond the sight of land from the starting shore. The implications of this early Australian colonisation extend beyond maritime capability to questions of navigation, social organisation, and planning. Successful colonisation required not a single crossing, but repeated voyages sufficient to establish viable populations. The colonisers brought with them not only their persons but their material culture, including stone tool technologies, and presumably their cultural traditions, including language and social organisation. The descendants of these colonisers developed the rich and complex cultural traditions documented in the ethnographic and archaeological record of Aboriginal Australia. The rock art traditions of Australia, while often difficult to date precisely, represent one of the longest continuous artistic traditions in human history. Styles including Bradshaw figures in the Kimberley region and hand stencils throughout the continent document artistic production, spanning tens of thousands of years. The symbolic systems embedded in Aboriginal rock art, connecting to still-living ceremonial and mythological traditions, provide rare insight into the meaning systems of ancient populations, though the application of recent interpretations to ancient images must proceed with appropriate caution. The Americas, last of the inhabited continents to be colonized by human populations, present different challenges for understanding prehistoric dispersal. The traditional model of human entry via the Bering Land Bridge during the last glacial maximum, approximately 20,000 to 15,000 years ago, has been complicated by evidence suggesting earlier coastal routes and potentially earlier dates of arrival. The Chirity Mastodon site in California, with claimed dates of approximately 130,000 years ago, based on uranium series dating of modified bone, would, if accepted, require complete revision of understanding of American colonization. Most archaeologists remain skeptical of such early dates, but the debate continues. The genetic evidence for American origins consistently points to Siberian source populations, though the timing and number of migration waves remain debated. The first Americans appear to have been adapted to high-latitude environments before their entry into the New World, bringing technologies and subsistence strategies developed in northeastern Siberia. Their subsequent rapid dispersal throughout the Americas, reaching the southern tip of South America within perhaps a few thousand years of initial entry, represents one of the fastest sustained migrations in human prehistory. The Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions that accompanied human colonization of the Americas have attracted considerable research attention. North America lost approximately 70% of its large mammal species, including mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, giant beavers, and numerous other taxa, within millennia of human arrival. Whether human hunting directly caused these extinctions, or whether climate change at the end of the Pleistocene was primarily responsible, remains debated. The Clovis culture, characterized by distinctive fluted projectile points appearing approximately 13,500 years ago, was once thought to represent the first American population. Its sophisticated hunting technology was invoked to explain megafaunal extinction. Earlier occupations now documented at sites including Monteverde challenge the primacy of Clovis, while maintaining evidence for association between human arrival and megafaunal decline. The accumulated evidence from archaeology, genetics, paleontology, and related disciplines presents a picture of human prehistory far more complex and interesting than earlier generations imagined. The 100,000 years before civilization were filled with cultural experimentation, environmental adaptation, technological innovation, artistic expression, and social organization that laid the foundations for everything that followed. The cognitive capacities that produced writing, mathematics, philosophy, and science were present throughout this period. What accumulated was the cultural knowledge that enabled their expression. The evidence examined in this investigation demonstrates that modern humans have possessed the fundamental cognitive capacities for symbolic thought, complex technology, and social organization for at least 100,000 years and probably much longer. The archaeological visibility of these capacities varied across time and space, probably reflecting demographic and environmental factors rather than cognitive evolution. The quote, 20 years were not empty but full of human activity that the archaeological record preserves only partially and imperfectly. Significant questions remain for future research to address. The relationship between population size, connectivity, and cultural complexity deserves continued investigation through both empirical research and theoretical modelling. The extent and nature of cognitive differences between modern humans and other hominin species, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, requires continued archaeological and genetic research. The mechanisms by which complex cultural traditions are maintained and transmitted across generations, and the conditions under which such traditions collapse, remain incompletely understood. The trajectory of research suggests that further revision of current understanding is likely as new sites are discovered, new analytical techniques are developed, and new theoretical frameworks are elaborated. The deep human past, once thought inaccessible to scientific inquiry, is increasingly yielding to investigation. Each new discovery adds detail to the emerging picture, while simultaneously revealing how much remains unknown. The 100,000 years before civilization, far from being empty time awaiting the arrival of history, emerge as the foundation upon which everything we call human achievement ultimately rests. The technological achievements of Middle Stone Age populations deserve particular attention, as they demonstrate problem-solving capabilities indistinguishable from those employed in modern engineering contexts. The production of bifacial points during the still bay industry, for example, required understanding of stone fracture mechanics, raw material selection based on predictable flaking properties, and the coordination of bilateral symmetry across hundreds of individual flake removals. Experimental archaeology suggests that producing a single finished bifacial point required approximately 30 minutes to several hours of skilled labour, depending on raw material quality and desired precision. The pressure flaking technique documented at Blombos Cave and other still bay sites represents particularly sophisticated stoneworking. Unlike direct percussion, which involves striking the stone with a hammer to remove flakes, pressure flaking requires sustained application of force through a pointed tool pressed against the edge. This technique enables removal of extremely thin, precise flakes that are impossible to produce through percussion alone. The resulting edges are straighter, sharper, and more symmetrical than those achievable through other methods. The technique requires understanding of force vectors, leverage, and the relationship between applied pressure and resulting fracture. The Silcrete heat treatment documented at Pinnacle Point adds another dimension to Middle Stone Age pyrotechnology. Silcrete, a naturally occurring stone formed by silica cementation of sediments, improves dramatically in its flaking properties when heated to temperatures between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius and then slowly cooled. The heating causes dehydration and structural reorganization of silica that reduces the force required for flaking and increases predictability of fracture propagation. Developing this technique required observation of accidental heat effects, systematic experimentation with temperature and duration, and knowledge transmission across generations. The compound adhesives used for hafting stone tools to wooden handles demonstrate chemical knowledge comparable in sophistication to these physical techniques. Analysis of residues from Sibudu Cave reveals recipes combining ochre with plant gums and animal fats in specific proportions. The ochre serves as a filler that improves adhesive strength and working properties. Different ochre types with varying iron content produce adhesives with different characteristics. The plant gums provide the binding matrix. Different species produce gums with different working times and final strengths. Animal fats adjust viscosity and drying time. Creating effective adhesives required understanding these components and their interactions, knowledge that must have been accumulated through extensive experimentation and transmitted through detailed instruction. The ecological knowledge implied by Middle Stone Age subsistence practices similarly demonstrates sophisticated understanding of natural systems. Exploiting coastal resources required knowledge of tidal cycles, seasonal variations in shellfish abundance and toxicity, the behavior and distribution of different marine species, and the locations of productive harvesting areas. Terrestrial hunting required understanding of animal behavior, seasonal movements, habitat preferences, and vulnerability to different hunting strategies. Plant gathering required knowledge of edible species identification, seasonal availability, processing requirements to remove toxins or improve palatability, and storage techniques for lean seasons. The scope of this ecological knowledge can be inferred from the diversity of resources documented at Middle Stone Age sites. Faunal assemblages include large mammals such as eland, buffalo, and various antelope species, medium-sized animals including warthogs and small antelope, small mammals, birds, tortoises, and marine resources including fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. Each of these resource categories required different acquisition strategies, processing techniques, and scheduling within annual subsistence cycles. The integration of these diverse resources into coherent subsistence systems implies planning capacity and environmental knowledge comparable to that documented in historically known hunter-gatherer populations. The social dimensions of Middle Stone Age life, while difficult to access archaeologically, can be partially inferred from material evidence for exchange and interaction. The movement of raw materials across considerable distances demonstrates that individual bands did not operate in isolation, but maintained connections with neighbouring populations. Obsidian from sources in the East African Rift has been identified at sites more than 200 kilometres distant. Marine shells appear at inland sites similarly remote from coastal collection areas. These patterns indicate exchange networks through which materials, and presumably people and ideas, moved across the landscape. The shell beads from Blombos Cave provide particularly interesting evidence for social signalling through material culture. The beads were manufactured from a single species of estuarine snail, suggesting deliberate selection rather than opportunistic collection. They were perforated through specific locations on the shell using consistent techniques, producing standardized objects suitable for stringing. The beads show use-wear patterns indicating extended periods of wear against skin or other materials. This combination of characteristics, species selection, standardized manufacture, and evidence for extended use suggests that the beads served as markers of identity or status that would have been recognizable across the social networks within which they circulated. The implications of such signaling objects for social organization deserve consideration. If shell beads conveyed information about their wearers, that information must have been meaningful within a shared system of conventions. The conventions themselves must have been established through social agreement and maintained through social learning. The system must have encompassed multiple social groups, as the exchange networks that moved raw materials would also have moved the people wearing ornaments marked with recognizable symbols. The presence of standardized ornaments 75,000 years ago thus implies social systems more complex than simple band-level organization. Systems involving shared symbolic conventions across multiple interacting groups. The question of population structure during the Middle Stone Age has attracted considerable attention from geneticists working with ancient and modern DNA. The evidence suggests that African populations during this period were characterized by significant internal structure, with partially isolated populations in different regions developing distinctive genetic signatures while remaining connected through occasional gene flow. This population structure may explain the Pan-African pattern of human evolution documented in fossil evidence. Rather than a single population evolving into modern humans in one location, multiple connected populations across the continent contributed to the emerging modern human gene pool. The genetic data also reveal episodes of population expansion and contraction that may correlate with environmental changes documented in paleoclimate records. Marine isotope stage 4, spanning approximately 74,000 to 59,000 years ago, brought relatively cold and dry conditions to much of Africa. Some genetic analyses suggest population contractions during this period, followed by expansions during the more favourable conditions of marine isotope stage 3. These demographic fluctuations may have affected the maintenance and transmission of cultural traditions, contributing to the intermittent archaeological visibility of complex behaviour during the Middle Stone Age. The relationship between genetic and cultural evolution during this period remains an area of active research. The emergence of adaptive genetic variants in response to environmental conditions would have operated on timescales of thousands of generations. Cultural adaptations, transmitted through social learning rather than genetic inheritance, could potentially respond more rapidly to environmental change. The interaction between these two systems, genetic adaptation setting constraints, within which cultural variation occurred, shaped the trajectory of human evolution in ways that neither system alone could have produced. The evidence for long-distance dispersal and colonization of new environments demonstrates that Middle Stone Age populations possessed the behavioral flexibility necessary to adapt to diverse ecological conditions. The expansion of human populations into previously unoccupied regions of Africa, including tropical forests and arid zones, required development of new subsistence strategies, technological adaptations, and social organizations suited to unfamiliar conditions. The success of these expansions indicates that the cognitive and cultural capacities for environmental adaptation were well developed long before the out of Africa dispersal that populated the rest of the world. The forests of Central Africa, in particular, pose challenges that earlier hominin species apparently could not overcome. Dense tropical forest provides limited visibility, few large prey animals, and plant foods that often require extensive processing to render edible. The presence of Middle Stone Age sites in forested regions of the Congo Basin and West Africa demonstrates that modern human populations successfully adapted to these demanding environments, probably through combinations of technologies and knowledge systems that the archaeological record preserves only incompletely. The arid zones of northern and southern Africa presented different challenges that were similarly overcome by Middle Stone Age populations. The Sahara, during the relatively moist conditions of marine isotope stage 5 approximately 130,000 to 74,000 years ago, supported lakes, rivers and savannas that permitted human occupation across what is now one of the world's most inhospitable deserts. Archaeological sites from this green Sahara period document human populations exploiting diverse resources and maintaining cultural traditions, with connections to populations both north and south. When conditions deteriorated, populations either moved to more favourable areas or developed adaptations that permitted continued occupation of increasingly marginal environments. The evidence from the Arabian Peninsula has attracted particular attention because of its potential role in the out of Africa dispersal. Stone tools resembling African Middle Stone Age technologies have been identified at multiple Arabian sites, including Jebel Fire in the United Arab Emirates, with dates around 125,000 years ago, and sites in Oman dating to approximately 106,000 years ago. These findings suggest that modern human populations reached Arabia, at least intermittently, tens of thousands of years before the main out of Africa dispersal that populated the rest of the world. Whether these early Arabian populations established permanent presence or represented temporary incursions that subsequently failed remains debated. The Levant, the narrow strip of land connecting Africa to Eurasia via the Sinai Peninsula, preserves evidence for repeated human presence extending back at least 180,000 years based on remains from Mislia Cave. The Skul and Kafsa caves, both in Israel, have yielded modern human fossils dated to approximately 90,000 to 120,000 years ago, associated with Middle Paleolithic stone tools similar to those produced by contemporaneous Neanderthal populations. The fate of these early Levantine modern human populations remains unclear. They may have been absorbed into Neanderthal populations, may have retreated back to Africa, or may have contributed to populations that later dispersed more widely. The genetic evidence suggests limited contribution to contemporary non-African populations, indicating that these early dispersals were not direct ancestors of people living today. The comparison between African Middle Stone Age and Eurasian Middle Paleolithic technologies reveals both similarities and differences that illuminate the nature of human cognitive evolution. Both complexes employed prepared core techniques for producing predetermined flake forms. Both exploited similar ranges of raw materials, including fine-grained stones selected for predictable flaking properties. Both show evidence for organised hunting of large mammals and systematic use of fire. However, the African record shows symbolic artefacts, beads, engravings, systematic ochre use that are rarer or absent in contemporaneous Neanderthal contexts. This difference, if real rather than an artifact of research intensity, might indicate subtle cognitive differences between populations or different social contexts that encouraged or discouraged symbolic expression. The recent evidence for symbolic behaviour among Neanderthals, including the controversial cave paintings from Spain dated to approximately 65,000 years ago, complicates straightforward distinctions between modern human and Neanderthal behavioural capabilities. If Neanderthals produced cave paintings before modern humans arrived in Europe, then at least some aspects of symbolic behaviour cannot be unique to our species. The genetic evidence for interbreeding suggests that behavioural differences between populations were not so great as to prevent successful social integration of hybrid offspring. The emerging picture is of populations with overlapping behavioural repertoires rather than qualitatively distinct cognitive capabilities. The question of what makes humans distinctively human, if anything does, has been fundamentally reframed by research into the deep human past. The traits once thought to mark the emergence of behavioural modernity, around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, are now documented far earlier in the African Middle Stone Age. The The traits once thought unique to modern humans are increasingly documented among Neanderthals and possibly other archaic hominin populations. The sharp boundaries between modern and archaic behaviour have blurred as evidence accumulates, leaving continuous variation where discrete categories were once perceived. This does not mean that all human populations were behaviourally identical. Clearly, there were variations across time and space in technological traditions, symbolic practices, and social organisations. Some populations developed innovations that others did not. Some maintained complex traditions that others lost. But these variations appear to reflect historical contingencies, the particular sequences of environmental conditions, demographic events, and cultural developments that shaped each population's trajectory, rather than fundamental differences in cognitive capability. The practical implications of this revised understanding extend beyond academic debates about human evolution. If the cognitive capacities for complex culture were present in human populations for hundreds of thousands of years before their consistent expression in the archaeological record, then the conditions for cultural flourishing deserve attention as variables independent of intrinsic capability. Population size, connectivity, environmental stability, and access to resources emerge as critical factors enabling the expression of human potential. Societies that provide these conditions enable human flourishing. Those that lack them constrain human achievement regardless of the abilities of their members. The 100,000 years before civilization, viewed from this perspective, represent not a waiting period before human potential could be realized, but a demonstration of what human populations achieved under conditions very different from those that characterize recent millennia. The shell beads of Blombos Cave, the cave paintings of Sulawesi, the monumental architecture of Göbekli Tepe, these achievements emerged from human populations living in small groups, moving across landscapes and making their livings through hunting, gathering, and fishing. The cognitive capacities that produced these achievements are the same capacities that later produced writing, mathematics, philosophy, and science. What differed was the accumulated cultural knowledge and the social conditions that enabled its development and transmission. The archaeological record of the deep human past continues to expand as research intensifies in previously understudied regions, and as new analytical techniques enable recovery of information from materials once considered uninformative. Ancient DNA extracted from fossil remains permits reconstruction of population relationships and movements. Stable isotope analysis of skeletal material reveals information about diet and mobility. Residue analysis of stone tools documents their use in activities that leave no direct trace. Computational modelling permits exploration of demographic and cultural dynamics beyond the reach of direct observation. Each methodological advance reveals new dimensions of prehistoric human life, while simultaneously highlighting how much remains unknown. The 100,000 years before civilization encompassed countless individual lives, each with its own experiences, relationships, and contributions to the ongoing human story. That most of these lives remain invisible to archaeological inquiry does not diminish their reality or significance. It merely reminds us of the limits of our methods and the vastness of the human past that extends beyond our ability to fully recover or comprehend. The evidence examined throughout this investigation establishes that anatomically and cognitively modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years. That evidence for symbolic thought and complex technology appears in the African archaeological record at least 100,000 years ago, and that the capacities underlying what we call civilization were present in human populations for tens of thousands of years before their consistent archaeological expression. The missing years were not empty, but full of human achievement that the archaeological record preserves only partially, and that we are only beginning to understand. The scholarly conversation surrounding these materials continues to evolve as new evidence accumulates and interpretive frameworks develop. Questions regarding the relationship between cognitive potential and cultural expression, the role of demographic factors in maintaining complex traditions, the environmental conditions that facilitated or constrained human behavioral flexibility, and the nature of the transition from foraging to agricultural economies remain subjects of active research and vigorous debate. The answers, as they emerge from ongoing investigation, will reshape understanding not only of the deep human past, but of human nature itself, what it means to be a member of this remarkable species with its extraordinary cognitive capacities, its complex social systems, and its capacity for achievement across the vast spans of time that preceded everything we call history. The methodologies employed in reconstructing the deep human past deserve particular attention as they determine what can be known and what remains beyond recovery. Radiocarbon dating, the foundation of archaeological chronology for much of the 20th century, reaches its practical limits at approximately 50,000 years ago, precisely the period when many of the most significant developments in human behavioural evolution occurred. Beyond this limit, alternative dating techniques must be employed, each with its own assumptions, limitations, and potential sources of error. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, which measures the time since sediment grains were last exposed to sunlight, has become a primary tool for dating Middle Stone Age sites in Africa. The technique depends on the accumulation of electrons in crystal defects following burial. Exposure to light releases these electrons, resetting the clock to zero. The method can date sediments from approximately 100 to 200,000 years old, covering the critical period of Middle Stone Age behavioural developments. However, incomplete bleaching of grains before burial, post-depositional disturbance, and variation in environmental dose rates can produce erroneous ages that must be identified through rigorous analytical protocols. Uranium series dating, based on the radioactive decay of uranium to thorium, provides an independent dating method applicable to materials including speleothems, corals, and teeth. The technique has been particularly valuable for dating rock art through analysis of calcite formations overlying painted surfaces. The recent dates for Indonesian cave art, pushing the record back to at least 67,800 years ago, were obtained through laser ablation uranium series analysis of minute calcite samples overlying the pigmented images. The precision and accuracy of such dates depend on assumptions about the closed system behaviour of the dated materials, assumptions that must be verified through careful sample selection and analytical protocols. Thermoluminescence dating, which measures light emission from heated materials when reheated in the laboratory, has been applied to burnt stone tools and other archaeological materials exposed to fire in antiquity. The technique provided the dates for the Jebel Irhoud site that pushed back the origin of our species to approximately 315,000 years ago. As with all radiometric dating methods, thermoluminescence requires careful assessment of the environmental conditions that determined the rate of radiation dose accumulation since the last heating event. The integration of multiple dating methods at individual sites, producing what geochronologists call a robust chronological framework, represents current best practice in archaeological dating. When different methods applied to the same stratigraphic sequence produce concordant ages, confidence in the chronology is strengthened. When different methods produce discordant ages, the sources of error must be identified and resolved before interpretation can proceed. This methodological rigour has been essential to establishing the revised chronology for human evolution that current research supports. Ancient DNA analysis has emerged as a transformative technology for understanding human population history. The extraction and sequencing of DNA from fossil remains, pioneered by Svante Pääbo and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, has revealed population relationships and movements invisible to archaeological methods alone. The complete Neanderthal genome, first published in 2010, demonstrated unequivocally that non-African human populations carry Neanderthal genetic contributions, a finding that resolved long-standing debates about whether modern humans and Neanderthals interbred. The technical challenges of ancient DNA work deserve appreciation. DNA degrades after death through hydrolysis and oxidation, fragmenting into increasingly small pieces that become difficult to distinguish from contaminating modern DNA. The warm climates that characterize many of the most important sites for human evolutionary research accelerate this degradation, limiting the preservation of ancient genetic material. Sites in the tropics of Africa, where modern human evolution occurred, rarely preserve ancient DNA amenable to current analytical methods. This creates a geographic bias in genetic data that must be acknowledged when interpreting results. Despite these limitations, ancient DNA has produced remarkable insights into human population dynamics during the late Pleistocene. The identification of Denisovans, known only from fragmentary fossils from Denisova Cave, was made possible by DNA preservation in cold cave sediments. The recognition that Denisovans contributed genetically to living human populations in Oceania and Southeast Asia revealed a previously unknown chapter in human evolutionary history. Continued advances in ancient DNA technology, including the extraction of DNA from warm climate sediments and from increasingly older samples, promise further revelations about the deep human past. Stable isotope analysis of archaeological materials provides information about past diets, mobility patterns, and environmental conditions that complements other lines of evidence. The ratios of carbon isotopes in bone collagen reflect the photosynthetic pathways of plants consumed directly or indirectly through the food chain. The ratios of nitrogen isotopes reflect trophic level, distinguishing herbivores from carnivores and permitting reconstruction of food webs. The ratios of strontium isotopes in tooth enamel reflect the geological composition of the landscape, where individuals lived during childhood, enabling identification of migrants versus local residents. Application of these techniques to Middle Stone Age materials has produced insights into the subsistence strategies and mobility patterns of early modern human populations. Analysis of faunal remains from coastal sites has confirmed marine resource consumption indicated by shell middens and has quantified the contribution of marine foods to overall diet. Analysis of human remains from the same sites has revealed individual life histories, including evidence for dietary change and geographic movement within lifetimes. The integration of isotopic data with archaeological context permits reconstruction of past lifeways at levels of detail previously unattainable. The study of microscopic residues and use wear on stone tools represents another methodological advance that has transformed understanding of prehistoric technology. Scanning electron microscopy reveals patterns of edge damage and polish that indicate the materials against which tools were used. Residue analysis identifies organic materials adhering to tool surfaces, including plant fibers, animal tissues, and hafting adhesives. Together, these methods permit reconstruction of tool function that moves beyond typological inference to direct evidence of past behavior. The application of these techniques to Middle Stone Age assemblages has documented the hafting of stone tools to wooden handles using compound adhesives, the use of stone points as spear tips evidenced by diagnostic impact fractures, and the processing of plant materials indicated by silica polish and phytolith residues. Each finding adds detail to the picture of Middle Stone Age technological organization, while simultaneously revealing the sophistication of problem solving that these populations applied to their material world. Computational modeling has become an increasingly important tool for exploring demographic and cultural dynamics that cannot be directly observed in archaeological data. Agent-based models simulate interactions among individual agents following specified behavioral rules, generating emergent patterns that can be compared with archaeological observations. Population genetic models simulate the effects of demographic processes including migration, gene flow, and selection on genetic diversity, producing predictions that can be tested against empirical data. Cultural transmission models explore the conditions under which innovations spread, persist, or disappear, providing theoretical frameworks for interpreting patterns of cultural change in the archaeological record. These modelling approaches have been particularly valuable for understanding the demographic conditions necessary for maintaining complex cultural traditions. Simulations by anthropologist Adam Powell and colleagues have demonstrated that population size and connectivity critically determine whether innovations accumulate or are lost through processes analogous to genetic drift. Small, isolated populations tend to lose adaptive innovations faster than they can develop new ones, resulting in cultural simplification despite unchanged cognitive capabilities. Large, interconnected populations maintain and develop innovations through redundancy and cultural storage. These findings provide theoretical context for interpreting the intermittent archaeological visibility of complex behaviour during the Middle Stone Age. The geographical distribution of research effort has historically biased understanding of human evolution toward European perspectives. The intensity of archaeological research in Europe, where academic institutions have conducted fieldwork for over a century, has produced far more detailed knowledge of the European archaeological record than of other world regions. This geographical bias has been particularly problematic for understanding human behavioural evolution, which the African evidence now demonstrates occurred primarily outside Europe. The expansion of archaeological research into previously understudied regions, including Africa, Southeast Asia and Australia, has progressively corrected this bias while revealing the inadequacy of models based primarily on European evidence. The Indonesian discoveries exemplify how expansion of research into new regions can transform scientific understanding. The rock art of Sulawesi, known to local populations for generations, attracted systematic scientific attention only in the early 21st century. The development and application of laser ablation uranium series dating to these sites produced dates that challenged assumptions about the uniqueness of European cave art. The continued exploration of Indonesian caves has produced progressively older dates, most recently the 67,800-year-old hand stencils from Muna Island, reported in January 2026. Further research in the region will likely produce additional discoveries that continue to revise understanding of early human artistic traditions. The public communication of archaeological discoveries poses challenges that researchers navigate with varying success. The need to attract research funding and public attention creates pressure to characterize findings in dramatic terms that may exaggerate their significance or certainty. The media's appetite for simple narratives conflicts with the nuanced, provisional nature of scientific interpretation. The result is often a public discourse about human evolution that oscillates between revolutionary claims and their subsequent qualifications, creating confusion about what scientists actually know and how confident that knowledge is. The responsible communication of research on the deep human past requires acknowledgement of uncertainty, attention to alternative interpretations, and clarity about the distinction between evidence and inference. The 100,000 years before civilization cannot be reconstructed with the same confidence that historians bring to documented periods. The evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, and subject to multiple interpretations. Progress occurs not through definitive conclusions, but through the gradual accumulation of evidence that narrows the range of viable interpretations, while occasionally requiring fundamental revision of previous understanding. The evidence assembled in this investigation supports several conclusions that command broad scholarly agreement. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years, based on fossil remains from Jebel Irhoud and related sites. Evidence for symbolic behaviour, including personal ornamentation and abstract representation, appears in the African archaeological record at least 100,000 years ago. The cognitive capacities underlying complex culture were present in human populations for tens of thousands of years before their consistent archaeological expression. The missing 100,000 years were filled with human activity that the archaeological record preserves only incompletely. These conclusions challenge the assumption that human prehistory was simply a waiting period before the emergence of civilization. The individuals who lived during the deep human past were fully human in every meaningful sense. Their achievements, though largely invisible to archaeology, established the foundation upon which subsequent developments built. Understanding this foundation remains essential for comprehending what humans are, how we came to be this way, and what possibilities remain open for our collective future. The 100,000 years before civilization emerged from this investigation not as empty time, but as the deep roots of human achievement. The shell beads, cave paintings, stone tools, and monumental structures preserved in the archaeological record represent the visible traces of lives lived with the same cognitive capacities that characterize humans today. What differed was not ability, but accumulated knowledge, population size, and environmental conditions. The potential was always present. Only the conditions for its expression varied across the vast spans of time that preceded everything we call history. The scholarly examination of this period continues to advance as new sites are discovered, new analytical techniques are developed, and new theoretical frameworks are elaborated. Each advance reveals new dimensions of prehistoric human life, while simultaneously highlighting how much remains unknown. The trajectory of research suggests that current understanding will undergo further revision as evidence accumulates. What seems likely to persist is the recognition that our species has possessed the fundamental capacities for complex culture for far longer than previously appreciated, and that the conditions enabling the expression of these capacities deserve attention as variables independent of intrinsic capability. The tablets remain in their museum cases, the shells rest in their collection drawers, the painted cave walls await their next visitors. Each preserves a fragment of the deep human past, a trace of lives lived long before the development of writing made direct communication across generations possible. Behind each artifact stood individuals whose experiences, relationships, and achievements constitute the real content of the period this investigation has examined. That we cannot access those lives directly does not diminish their significance. It merely reminds us of the limitations of our methods and the vastness of human experience that extends beyond our ability to fully recover or comprehend.